And I think Ursula Guin's work is a particularly generative site to look at this relationship between narrative creation and political organizing. We see this very directly in the word for world. It's a hard title for me to say. The world for word is forest, particularly through the role of dreaming. There's definitely a great deal of physical action in the novel, and much of this action consists of anti-colonial resistance led by Selver. There's the basic daily work of resistance. Selver and the system of runners, they travel between communities, they communicate with people, they organize people. And then further, Selver and his comrades develop martial tactics and execute actions of violent resistance. And they perform these actions very effectively by the end of the book. However, I would argue that the most important action performed by Selver and other characters in the text is not a physical act, but this non-material interior act of dreaming. The Guin makes it clear that the practical organizing and resistance couldn't occur without that dream work. In the novella, Le Guin distinguishes between the equally real dream time and world time and explores Achaean culture's understanding of the skill and responsibility, she uses these words, required in dreaming. We encounter characters who are renowned in their communities for being, quote, great dreamers. Le Guin portrays dreaming as connected to action and radical action at that. And you'll see I'm working with some of the same passages, Christopher, here. So we see that Selver takes on the role of, quote, one who could speak aloud the perceptions of the subconscious. To speak that tongue is to act, to do a new thing, to change or be changed radically from the root, for the root is the dream. So in my talk today, I want to explore a bit about what this radical act of dreaming and of verbalizing dreams looks like, not just in the novella, but in our world. Before I go any further with this discussion of dreaming, however, I'm going to indulge in a brief autobiographical aside, just to contextualize why it felt so important for me to come here and connect my own process of storytelling to this particular Le Guin text. So in the house I grew up in, my father had a collection of 70s and 80s sci-fi paperbacks on the shelves. And this included the 2 volumes of Ellison's Again, Dangerous Visions anthologies, which Christian mentioned earlier, and then the later slim standalone paperback edition of The Word for World is Forest. And I was born in the US in '84, so the Vietnam War was sort of always just behind us in spoken and unspoken ways. No one kind of like knew what to make sense of the violence that had stretched on pointlessly for years and then ended in a sort of humiliation of American empire. And in my house, my parents, they positioned themselves as anti-war. They both protested the war. But my uncle lived with us for a period when he was homeless, and he had fought in Vietnam as a combat Marine. He was in country during the Tet Offensive, and he eventually died from a cancer that's now been officially attributed to Agent Orange, which is a military defoliant used by the U.S. Army. So, which is to say, it's a weapon that kills people as it kills trees and plants. So, in this house I grew up in, Le Guin's stories and the afterlives of a particular type of imperial violence and participation in that violence were both things that were present and sort of tied together for me. And this connection between the Vietnam War and the novella is, of course, not unique to my perspective or experience. Excuse me. The sci-fi author Ian Watson summed it up in a 1975 article in Science Fiction Studies, quote, "The analogy between terror conduct on Asha and the American intervention in Vietnam is explicit." And then in a 1977 interview, Le Guin herself described the process of writing The Word for World is Forest as stemming from an inability to engage with or affect change through street protest against the Vietnam War while living in England. My hands were sort of tied, she tells the interviewer, who is a self-identified anti-war activist. I felt trapped, so it came out in that story. It's the most topical story I ever wrote, the pain and outrage that wouldn't be put down, end quote. So what interests me here is not so much the ways in which Le Guin clearly does comment on the Vietnam War in this work of fiction, but the fact that she turned to fiction as an alternative to street protest actions. So in my reading of the text, I'm working on the understanding that the novella is not just a response to horrific state actions, but also a self-reflexive text about its own medium and form, how fiction might be a response to state actions. So that is to say that Le Guin's depiction of dreaming in the novella I'm taking is directly related to her own socially engaged practice of speculative fiction. And out of this, I can hopefully learn something about my own fiction practice and maybe offer something useful for the fiction practice of others. And I think in many ways, all fiction functions as sort of a communicable dream. The fiction writer's goal is to make an interior experience accessible or at least visible to others through organized narrative. John Gardner, in his highly influential craft book, The Art of Fiction, talks about effective fiction as a, quote, vivid and continuous dream. I think it's appropriate for me to bring in this craft text here because Le Guin depicts dreaming as an active, skilled craft, not just as an experience of sort of passive reception. At one point in the novella, a great dreamer interrogates Selver about his craft, asking questions such as, Do you dream well, Selver? Do you hold the dream in your hands? And do you weave and shape, direct and follow, start and cease at will? And these would be good questions for a writer to ask herself as well. These are craft questions. But with an overtly socially engaged writer like Le Guin, the scope of the dream is bigger than it often was for someone like Gardner, at least in his more insular fictions. Le Guin's work is, as I'm sure we've all considered in different ways, is rooted in the idea that speculative fiction offers access to a vision of a future that we all might potentially inhabit. And this is a lot of what we've all been talking about today. And this is an idea that has gained traction in the intervening decades since Le Guin. More and more contemporary speculative fiction writers see an anti-oppressive politics as integral to the writing of speculative fiction. Walida Emerisha addresses this tendency beautifully in her introduction to the 2015 anthology Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. Quote, whenever we try to envision a world without war, she writes, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction, end quote. And ultimately, Emerisha makes a connection between what she calls visionary fiction and dreams, posing the question, quote, are we brave enough to imagine beyond the realities of the world, and then do the hard work of sculpting reality from our dreams? And I see Joseph's comment about Walida. Yeah, I actually remember her from when I was like a 14-year-old punk rock kid in Philly, like from seeing her in art spaces and activist spaces. So she's definitely, even before her academic career, definitely been an inspiration to me as well. I remember her doing anti-war work and being at slam poetry events. And I was just like a little punk rock kid. Anyway, so the anthology Octavia's Brood is obviously positioned in a particular Afrofuturist tradition, as the title locates the author in a genealogy emanating from Octavia Butler. Afrofuturism is a genre, and a particularly crucial genre of speculative vision. Let me try that again. Afrofuturism is a genre, and particularly crucial genre of speculative fiction, but it's also part of a larger Black diasporic tradition of radical imagination and engagement with past and futures. Robin Kelley explores this tradition in his influential book, Freedom Dreams, which came out 20 years ago, but I think is being read by a whole new generation now. Kelley argues the most radical art is not protest art, but works to take us to another place, envisioning a different way of seeing, perhaps, a different way of feeling, end quote. Kelley's work draws heavily on that of the Martinician poet Aimé Césaire, particularly Césaire's proclamation, poetic knowledge is born in the great silence of scientific knowledge. Césaire's words, I think, are at the core of a lot of what I'm discussing today and what we're all talking about today, this idea that important work is done in the imagination because it can't be done elsewhere. So obviously a lot of what I'm citing right now is referencing Black diasporic tradition, Black diasporic thought. That's where so much of the work has happened and is happening, and I can't give that tradition enough respect. But it isn't my personal tradition or family tradition. And as I've stated at the start of this talk, a lot of what I'm trying to work through is my own situation as a writer. So out of that, I want to pivot to talking a little bit about my tradition, which is the Jewish diasporic tradition. And when I say as a pivot, I don't mean to imply that these traditions are discrete from each other or that they don't overlap and there isn't dialogue and appropriations in so many relationships. Merely just positioning myself as a Jewish writer here. And in Jewish diasporic literature, there's a huge emphasis on the relevance of dreams to people's lives and on the narrativization of dreams as a strategy to communicate messages about the world to come, to transcend earthly conditions, and even to disrupt time and space. You see this at least as far back as late antiquity with Merkabah and Heschel, which means like charity and palaces literature. And this is basically a genre or pair of genres where they describe traveling to different parts of the heavens and encountering divine secrets. So one text in this genre, for example, is called, and I love this title, The Book of Lesser Heavenly Palaces. And there's a line in this book that I keep coming back to for years. Quote, Rabbi Akiva said, I had a vision and I observed the whole inhabited world. I saw it just as it is, end quote. So there's this sense here that dreams are not just part of reality, but the clearest part of reality. And you see these esoteric dreams continue to be explored through Kabbalistic traditions, and then from there into Hasidism, where they became popularized into working class tales, so greater access to these dream narratives. And I'm not going to get too bogged down in genealogies here, but you see this narrative tradition coming directly from Hasidism into modern fiction, and particularly speculative fiction, most clearly through Kafka. He has stories, for instance, one that's just called A Dream, where a man dreams about the beauty of his own grave, which I think might be a lot of what we're talking about today. Dreaming about the beauty of our own graves. Anyway, many contemporary Jewish activists draw on this tradition to create liberatory visions. The Jewish anarchist Cindy Milstein writes of a Jewish diasporic tradition of, quote, weaving roots/relations of magical carrying spaces as prefiguration, end quote. And back to this word prefiguration, which come up a little bit today. So this is certainly an approach I share. But the fact of the matter is that whether I like it or not, and to be very clear, I don't like it, Zionism also draws on the same Jewish dreaming tradition. The founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, set out his vision in a 1902 German language novel called Alt Neuland, which means Old New Land. And this is a near future speculative novel about an imagined egalitarian Eurocentric Jewish society in Palestine. Robert Silverberg, who, well-known sci-fi writer, who I think actually, and someone might correct me on this, published The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas in the New Dimensions anthology. He describes the Herzl novel as a prophetic work of utopian fantasy, and connects it to older Jewish texts such as time travel episodes in the Talmud and the fabulated 9th century travelogue of Eldad Hadani. The paternalistic colonial vision of statist vision of Herzl's novel is obviously not a good thing, but it's less extreme than that of another novelist who's been on my mind, Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, which is a terroristic movement. Before that, he was a Russian language journalist and fiction writer in Odessa. He wrote a historical novel about Palestine and a contemporary novel about Jewish life in Odessa. A few people might still read that latter novel, but the text which had the most lasting impact is an essay called The Iron Wall. To get to the point, and just to be very clear, it's a racist, settler colonialist, hyper-nationalist polemic. It contains a monstrous and genocidal vision. Even though it's a mostly straightforward political manifesto, it draws on the central and titular figurative image of, quote, an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. And this vision is central to the militarized apartheid state and that exists in Israel and Palestine today. Jabotinsky's influence can be traced very directly through his role in organizations like Irgun and Likud, his relationship with the Netanyahu family, and his dream is now the reality there. And there is an actual wall, the separation barrier, which cuts through Israel-Palestine. So this current horrific crime is the literalization of a metaphor crafted by a novelist. And I think this might relate to some of the things, Christopher, you were bringing up in your description of Northern Ireland and discussion of partition as well. So it might feel like I've gotten a bit afield from Le Guin and the word for world is forest to rant about Zionism, but the reason I've been thinking about Jabotinsky lately as I've reread Le Guin's novella is because of this character of Captain Davidson, who Cheryl gave us that great close reading of earlier. The Terrans are officially part of an extractive, interstellar, imperial presence, which follows a certain logic and system of relations to this new world. So forestry planning, an increasingly accountable chain of command back to Earth, even the benevolent and patronizingly empathetic anthropological project, which Le Guin is, I think, pretty fond of, are all part of this system. Davidson and his followers, on the other hand, constitute a renegade settler colonialist movement, which is frenzied in its violence, unaccountable to Earth, and concerned with possessing the land in very specific ways through permanent habitation, environmental destruction, rape, and increased levels of genocide, or accelerated genocide, maybe we could say. And what troubles me about this is not so much Davidson's actions, but the way in which his vision is, as has come up today, situated very closely parallel to Selver's. Towards the end of the book, Selver addresses the relationship very directly, telling Davidson, we're both gods, you and I. You're an insane one, and I'm not sure whether I'm sane or not, but we are gods. And earlier in the text, it's been explained that this word God is an English translation of the Eshean word shahab, which, depending on its context, and she notes a gendered context, its usage can refer to a powerful being or to a translator or interpreter. And Christopher, I know, just took us through this paragraph, but I'll read it quickly since it's pretty crucial here. The anthropologist Lubov spends some time parsing this connection, speculating that a god on Asha might, quote, be one who could translate into waking life the central experience of vision, one serving as a link between the two realities, the dream time and the world time, end quote. So Davidson, in this definition, certainly is a god too, because he can bring his own terrible vision from the dream time into the world time of Asha. So I guess one thing I'm really wrestling with is that not all dreams are good dreams. And as has come up today, even Selver's liberatory dream is harmful in that it introduces a new violence to the society. For the scope of today's talk and the topic of today's symposium, I'll limit it there to the word for world is forest. But I think this discussion could certainly be extended to a discussion of the Lathe of Heaven as well, Le Guin's near future novel from the same era, set where many of you are in Oregon. The main character in that book discovers to his horror that his dreams have material effect on the world. He calls these affective dreams. So I think she's continuing to work with in a very different setting with some of the same questions of the reality and effect of dreams in that novel as well. So again, I don't have a conclusion to my tensions, but where I'll conclude the talk is just sitting with this idea that imagined narratives are truly powerful, but because they're truly powerful, they're dangerous. This phrase, dangerous visions, and again, dangerous visions from those anthologies keep echoing in my mind. For this reason, dreams are vital. Our dreams are vital to fighting fascist and nationalist dreams, because those are dreams too. We need to fight the vivid dreams, the vivid, effective dreams, really, of the Captain Davidsons of the world with our own skillful dreams. We hold a powerful and effective weapon as storytellers because we have the power to shape realities that people experience. This means that we have power to hurt people, but also hopefully power to defend people and nurture people and communities. So I'd say that like any weapon, a firearm, or anything else, storytelling should be treated with great care and responsibility. When the Ashian resistance movement first begins to build, a village headwoman considers the relationship between dreaming and political action. Quote, "It was the dreamer's responsibility to be careful, to be certain that his judgment was true. Her responsibility was to then take that judgment and act upon it." So I'll end with that quote. Thank you.